Well, that goes back to Caesar Augustus, I would say. Anybody that opposed him, you needed to know about it first of all, and once that happened, they would disappear. Well, the same was true in the Soviet Union or East Germany with the Stasi. If you said anything out of line, you ended up in jail. Or in a sanitarium or something, or in a gulag somewhere. That same was true of the Nazis and the Gestapo and SS. They would do the same to people. Now, this is historically true. This is the way totalitarian states operate, and this is gathering knowledge about people and the entire population is a totalitarian procedure. That was the first thing that hit me right away. This was obvious, the route we were taking. And so that's why I've been opposing it since they started it in 2001. The real threat, the only threat we really faced were really domestically. We have done to ourselves fundamentally what the terrorists wanted done but could never achieve. We have done to ourselves. And this is the domestic threat that our constitutional and the oath of office that we took was given to prevent. This is the only way no other country in the world could have done to us what we have done to ourselves. And so this is the time when all good Americans need to stand up and oppose this. You have to be aware that these agencies are threatening what is fundamental to human rights everywhere. And you've got to ensure that you have some way of verifying and keeping these agencies in line.
This is the part we're going to do some sound bites. So I have a question for you, such as encryption. Is it safe?
The short answer is no. Virtually everything is suspect now because of the program Bull Run, which is the NSA program to weaken encrypt systems, not counting putting in backdoors. This is how you weaken a encrypt system so you can break it. So, and you don't know how many they've done that to, although it appears from what's been released by Snowden that they have been quite successful at it. There's really a kicker there on that program that no one has really taken up. When you weaken firewalls and weaken operating systems and weaken encrypt systems, you open up everybody to hackers around the world. And so therefore they hack into all kinds of things, getting all your data and everything. So you're not really protecting your communications, you're weakening it. It's a very short-sighted, finite thinking that they had when they did that. Also, one side of NSA, is data protection, right? And the other is operations for getting into other people's data, so they're working against each other.
So by trying to keep yourself safe in the technotronic era, we're actually drawing red flags and creating attention for ourselves from people who might want to break that encryption or already have the keys to break that encryption. Well,
and exposing it to other, after all, NSA doesn't have a monopoly on smart people. Other agencies around the world have smart people also. If there's a weakness in a encrypt system, other people can find it too. Or if there's a weakness in a firewall or an operating system, other people can find that too. And that's how they can break into things.
What is privacy, and why is it our right as individuals to have it?
The principal thing about privacy came out of the Revolutionary War when the British broke into U.S. Houses of U.S. people, and they would go anywhere and do anything they wanted with a general writ, which meant that we here in the United States had no privacy whatsoever as a colony of the government at the time, the British government. So that was kind of the impetus to create the Fourth Amendment that said before you could do that, you had to have evidence that would show probable cause that someone in this country was doing something illegal or preparing a violent action or something. They would have some probable cause to show to a judge with the name of the person, the reason you're doing it, where you're going to have the warrant served, and where you're going to search and what you're searching for. That's all in the Fourth Amendment, and that's why it was written that way. It was because the U.S. government, the central government, was never intended to have information on all the citizens of the United States. In order to get that, they were supposed to have a warrant. Didn't matter how they claimed they could get it, like third-party doctrine or any of that. That intent was in the Constitution from the very beginning. They were not supposed to have it unless they had a warrant with probable cause.
So if privacy is our protection to keep our hard work from being plundered, can you compare that idea to that of, Soviet Russia or the Stasi in East Germany?
Yeah, directly, simply because those were the targets that I was working in NSA while I was there for almost 30 years. And it was their entire point was they had to know everything about their population they possibly could so they could control it. I mean, that's what the Stasi did. That's what the KGB and the MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs, in the Soviet Union did. So they kept track of everybody as best they could, and except they were doing it all manually, keeping manual files and things like that. They didn't have anywhere near the capacity we do now with the electronic age and the digital age and the software and the programs and the access that NSA does. So it's directly analogous, except it's in electronic form, not in paper form.
So it's not exactly history repeating, but it certainly rhymes, and now they have more technological power to carry out what they're trying to do.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
How's the average individual adversely affected by NSA surveillance?
Actually, it's hard to say there's any impact, immediate impact on the individual per se, not yet anyway, unless you become a target or try to get politically active and are espousing principles or other directions or advocating for other kinds of operations that for the government that the current administration doesn't like, at which case you can become a target. Like the Tea Party and the IRS, how they're using this data to go after the Tea Party. It's how you use information about people. It's power over people. If you don't like what someone's doing, you use that data against them.
Have they gone outside the limits of the Constitution?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was my complaint from the very beginning. When they started this domestic spying in 2001, the most recent iteration of domestic spying, I would add. This goes back to at least World War II with program Shamrock, and after that,
and Minaret, yeah,
and Minaret. Well, that was during the Nixon times when he was after the anti-war protesters.
That's
and
right.
Other people didn't agree with his administration's position. He got the FBI using COINTELPRO, the CIA with a program called Chaos, and NSA with Minaret. Those were programs all oriented against these people that the administration didn't particularly care for, opposing the war and so on. And they were the ones then collecting the data for the administration and doing things like in COINTELPRO trying to get people to commit suicide or manipulate people in different ways using the information that was collected from Minaret, Chaos, or COINTELPRO.
What happens when we have regulation without representation?
Well, you have basically what's going on in that case is you have an uninformed electorate being duped by a current government and being told lies and repeated lies till they get believed. I mean, that was the general principle of Adolf Hitler. If you're going to tell a lie, make it a big one. Tell it often until it's believed. That's the principle they're using, repetition. Like it's all legal, it's all legal, it's all legal, except in the case of when they had to give retroactive immunity to the telecoms, or except now in the case where they have a bill in Congress that's giving retroactive immunity to the internet service providers. Why? Because they've been committing crimes. And they're liable if the Department of Justice is not going to take them on in criminal court, which they're not. Others have the option to sue them in civil court, and that's why they had to give them the retroactive immunity.
What actions are people taking today that are, with respect to technology, kind of naive in the current environment?
Well, one of the biggest ones is Facebook. I mean, people are putting their whole lives out there on Facebook. They don't realize that that's being captured. The FBI, for example, looks at Facebook as one of the richest environments for them to investigate. So, but it's also being stored and captured by and used by different agencies. Like NSA is pulling that data in, as well as corporations. They're also using this data. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing corporations are more trying to sell you something. It's more of a marketing kind of approach, where they're trying to figure out what you like or the kinds of things they should send or push advertisements to you, whereas the FBI is looking at it for ways and means to, if you're being targeted, ways and means to either arrest you or take you out or put you in, like they did with the CEO of Quest, Nacho. They put him in jail, like they tried to do with Tom Drake and like they tried to do with us. Try to use that information to build a circumstantial case and they basically fabricate evidence, which they did in our case. So the difference between government, which is more malicious than industry, is they're really still doing the same kind of thing. They're invading the privacy of everybody, and people are actually helping them by putting all this information out there, either in Twitter or in Facebook or any number of other ways, like an email, for example. That all that kind of information is being collected and it's being used against them.
So there's a tight relationship between the corporations that are spying on us to collect our private data and the intelligence communities that are also scanning for metadata or stealing it out of Angry Birds, as I heard Mike Hayden once say. You know, he's like, Angry Birds is already stealing your data. We're just sniffing their stream as it goes to Angry Bird Central, I think was his quote.
Well, and they also, the program they're using to do that kind of sniffing is, the primary program is Fairview. That one has between 80 and 100 taps on the fiber optic network inside the continental U.S. It's on the web. You can go take a look at the different fiber optic tap points, but that's how they're acquiring the information as it's passing by on the fiber network. That was also, it was also mentioned along with other programs as the upstream program in the PRISM slide that was released by Edward Snowden also. It was the first one. Fairview, Stormbrew, Blarney, and Oakstar were the ones that they listed. Fairview, the first three, I think, were all U.S. corporations. The Oakstar is foreign corporations. So that, and those were, there are about 8 of them, I guess, according to the data that's been published. Poland was one of them, some Polish telecommunications company. But I don't. The others haven't been released by the Snowden in the Snowden material anyway. But they're foreign companies, so it's a mixture of U.S. and foreign companies around the world, along with foreign governments. And if they don't get cooperation either from the companies or the governments, they'll unilaterally do it. So they have a massive tap network on the entire internet and the fiber optic public switch telephone network. So that's a huge data acquisition system.
How necessary is it to the collection of intelligence that you map out the social networks of your targets?
If you're focused on targets, that is groups of individuals doing something illegal or criminal or some terrorist group, that's a legitimate operation of intelligence. Try to figure out potential adversaries or potential threats. That's legitimate. Every country in the world would say that's what they do or want to do too, within the means and capabilities they have. But when you start mapping out the social networks of everybody on the planet, that's a totally different issue. Now you're getting into the privacy of everyone that is not even a threat. So you're accumulating information on everybody in the world and all of their activities, everything they do. And it basically gets down to the ability, even after you accumulate that, you can look at their profiles and begin to see how they think and what they're thinking about issues. And you can even begin to project how they will act or react to situations. Although right now they're not very good at that. That there is a capability to do that, and we have been able to successfully do that in the past. And they're attempting at least. That's one of the initiatives that the White House let I think in early 2012, they let a big White House Big Data Initiative, which was a solicitation from industry to work out algorithms that would go into large data sets to figure out what's important for people to look at. That's how you automate the process of analyzing all of this data to boil it down to what's really important, which they should have been doing in the beginning, and it could have done right at the beginning, which is what we did in our program, Thin Thread, which would pull out only that data that was relevant to groups of individuals intending to do something criminal or terrorist type activities. around the world, or other governments or leaders and so on. All those were legitimate intelligence targets, foreign intelligence targets. They could have done that right from the beginning, instead of having this knowledge about everybody. What that's done is give them an entire rich database for other agencies of the government, like the FBI and the DEA and the Department of Homeland Security and the IRS, to go in and examine everybody in the country and everybody virtually on the planet that's using internet or phone networks.
So they're spying on everybody, collecting metadata, they're building profiles out of it. What is the reasoning behind pointing such an apparatus at the American public? And what type of money, what combined budgets of these type of projects focused on the American people? What are we looking at?
But the reason that I came up with that they were doing that is primarily for money and building an empire. The reason I say that is because if you take the position of collecting only targeted information against groups doing bad things, then you have a finite problem. So you don't have to have large storage facilities like Bluffdale in Utah or another 400,000 square foot facility in San Antonio, Texas, or another one they just started building last summer on Fort Meade in Maryland, 600,000 square foot facility to store information. You wouldn't need any of that. Plus, you wouldn't need all the contracts for contractors, and you wouldn't need to have a larger workforce. But you would be focused on a rich environment of information, which actually would mean you would succeed at preventing terrorism and preventing crime, international crime, and so on. But by taking in the bulk acquisition, that means you're taking in everything in the world. That means you're pulling in all kinds of huge amounts of information, hundreds of terabytes per day, going around the network. That becomes a management problem of information to begin with. How you have to build an infrastructure to transport it to storage facilities. You have to build the storage facilities. You have to have contracts for all this to happen, and contracts to manage all the data once you've captured it, and then contracts to build other kinds of programs to manipulate the data and use it for analysts and so on, and then hire more analysts to analyze data because there's orders of magnitude more data to look at. So, and it builds your budget so much bigger, and so now you're managing a much larger empire. So they did it, in my sense, for empire.
Well, they told us they were doing it for the prevention of terrorism, so that would mean none of these programs were underway pre-9/11, right?
Well, there was clearly an intent to do it prior to 9/11, and certainly there was in history, down through history, with Program Minaret at NSA anyway, and Shamrock, those programs, they were doing that all the way back to World War II. Those are the programs that came out with the Church Committee investigation into NSA, FBI, and CIA back in the mid-'70s. And as part of that, that's when the FISA law was written, and that's when the intelligence committees were created, the Senate and House Intelligence Committees and the FISA Court. They were all created to have oversight of the intelligence community to ensure that they did not do domestic spying. So that oversight was supposed to prevent this type of domestic spying. Instead, now they're all advocates for it. The courts, the intelligence committees, they're all advocating for NSA to do this kind of thing, all under the false pretense that it's going to prevent terrorism. Well, what it's done is made what it's done fundamentally is add orders of magnitude more data for their analysts to look at every day, and they can't get through that data, and so they're dysfunctional, and so we don't stop things like the Boston bomber, the Fort Hood shooter, the Times Square bomber, the underwear bomber. People are trying to do things that they should have been stopped. Even 9/11 should have been stopped, but even with the data that we had, but it wasn't. That's because their analysts are dysfunctional. They can't function under the environment they've created for them.
Well, they're incentivized to keep filling up their budgets and expending their budgets so they can keep growing their budgets and grow power. But what occurs to me is there's a historical relationship between mass surveillance on a population and the crushing of dissent of that population. Can you explain that?
Well, that goes back to Caesar Augustus, I would say. Anybody that opposed him, you needed to know about it, first of all, and once that happened, they would disappear. Well, the same was true in the Soviet Union or East Germany with the Stasi. If you said anything out of line, you ended up in jail. Or in a sanitarium or something, or in a gulag somewhere. That same was true of the Nazis and the Gestapo and SS. They would do the same to people. Now, this is historically true. This is the way totalitarian states operate, and this is gathering knowledge about people and the entire population is a totalitarian procedure. That was the first thing that hit me right away. This was obvious, the route we were taking. And so that's why I've been opposing it since they started it in 2001.
How would you describe a panopticon?
I'm not really good at doing that kind of thing.
Do you know what it is?
It's not clear to me.
Okay. I'll just explain. You don't have to address it at all, but just so we're on the same page. East India Company employed this guy named Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham was asked to create a metaphorical prison that they ended up trying to build in Russia later. But it's, the guard towers had mirrors on it, and so it could see all the prisoners at the same time. So the prisoners always think that they're being watched, but they can never see if there's somebody in the guard tower pointing a gun at them. They just know that sometimes people get shot from the guard tower. And it's a state of living in fear and using fear to control people's actions as...
Well, I mean, yeah, okay. That's the state we're in. I mean, fear-mongering is the way our government's been operating. Fear-mongering first for terrorism to build up the budget, and they've been playing that card too many times. Now they're looking at cybersecurity as the next fear, and then they'll find something else later on. The point is, and they never really want to solve the problem. That's been the basic issue with it, because once you solve the problem, you don't have the problem to have justification to get more money. So. That my version of their vision statement came out like this, that for them it's keep the problem going so the money keeps flowing. I mean, otherwise, if you solve the problem, you don't have that problem to justify more money and more of an empire and to sustain your empire. So that's really what they're operating. Originally, I thought it was, aim low and miss was their vision statement, because everything they ever did, they failed at. I didn't quite understand it till the latter part of my career, that they were really not solving the problem because they didn't want to. It was a matter of keeping it going so they can get the next contract or get the next set of budget from the Congress and so on. Keep it going.
And when left in the dark, they've been pointing those budgets at us. They've been targeting Americans. And we can talk about the potentials of kill lists and things like that are floating around in our world these days. But they're pointing this technology that's coming from taxpayer money back at the taxpayers, which seems very, much like, East Germany or Soviet Union.
Well, you have to look at it also, in order to do the bulk acquisition of data, the largest amount of data is being passed around inside the United States, around the world. I mean, the pockets of where information is really ballooning are in the United States, in Europe, and in Japan, and in Korea, South Korea, and so on. Those are the big areas. In fact, 80% of the fiber optic network for transporting the communications of the world really is within the United States, or passing through the United States. So that this is really what they call the hometown advantage. Being able to monitor the communications, for example, of South Americans, because the South American cables run from South America to Miami and then back down to South America. That's not by chance, by the way. That gives us a look into everything that's going down there, and they can then capture all that information from places inside the United States. They don't have to be overseas to do it. That's true for about 80% of it, but the other 20% is where they have to. That's really the target they should be looking at, really, not the internal United States. But they decided that with bulk acquisition of data, U.S. citizens were first. We were the first ones collected that way. So the rest of the world is no more than being treated simply just like all the rest of us, all of us U.S. citizens. So we're all being treated the same.
Recently, I saw a headline come out of the London Guardian, I believe it was, where you said that the reason the NSA was surveilling its own population was for totalitarian population control. Can you say that again in your own words? Again, it falls back to the principles of totalitarianism and how dictators and so on have operated down through the centuries. I mean, it's know what your people are doing and find the ones who are not conforming to what you want them to do, and then get rid of them. And that's
fundamentally what this process does. It gives them that kind of knowledge about everyone in the country. And if you start to speak up about some issue or something, you get noticed, and then they have all that data already assembled on you, and they simply go compile it and look at it and see how they could influence you to do what they would conceive to be the right thing. So that's how you use it against people, and you make sure that they know that you know about what they've got, and so then they fear you one way or the other, or will conform to your wishes, if they can't find anything on you specifically, but they can find something on someone you care about, then they'll use that against you. So it's just like this. That's standard KGB tactics also.
Well, and in terms of population control, I think what you're pointing out is they're trying to change the attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs of a target population to be more easily malleable and controlled by authority.
Actually, they don't have to do that. All they have to do is make sure that everybody knows what they're doing. Then people basically change what they're doing. I mean, people I know have already changed how they operate, how they communicate internationally, how they, for example, Chris Hedges, who has said to me, he's finding it very difficult to do any investigative reporting anymore because he can't find any sources that will talk to him. And so they're not talking, so they're modifying their behavior, whereas they used to talk to him about things off the record. Now they can't do that, or they don't do that because they're afraid of being monitored. And the existing government is threatening everybody with prosecution if they leak. For example, they still have 9 prosecutions pending on the Espionage Act from 1917 with I think 9 different people who have been whistleblowers, classic whistleblowers, and they're trying to silence that, and that's the way they threaten people. And so people internally in government have changed how they operate. They no longer are willing to talk to anybody that's a reporter. And so that's changing how we no longer have a free press that can interrogate and probe into government activities.
What would freedom look like in America if privacy was restored and the NSA was following the Constitution, for instance?
Well, you would actually be what the founders of this country envisioned as what it should be. That is a country where people have the freedom to be creative and innovative without having the fear of being observed or disapproved of, even before they can try to institute or start to implement an idea that they had. So that's how civilization advances. When you take away that freedom to feel like you can do anything here, the sky is the limit here, you aren't bounded by anything, then you take that away. Why? People withdraw like they did in East Germany or in the Soviet Union. They become very withdrawn, afraid to do anything because their next door neighbor or some other person would be spying on them and reporting them. And so they stagnate as a civilization. They become drunkards and like they did in the Soviet Union, a lot of alcoholics in the Soviet Union because they were frustrated. They couldn't feel that they had the freedom to be creative and innovative. And that destroys human aspirations, basically.
Are you optimistic about the future of freedom?
Actually, it's one of the main problems I see is that this way of doing bulk acquisition of information on the population is spreading through the democracies of the world. It's not a question of just creating it here in the U.S. I mean, we are spreading this around the world. I mean, the Five Eyes are using it, and it's spreading to some other countries. There are other cooperative efforts with third parties under a program called Rampart A, where they're starting to do the same kind of thing. And this kind of knowledge and information about the population is being used by law enforcement through the MLAT mutual law enforcement agreements and treaties, and it's being used worldwide. So the people cooperating, other law enforcement agencies around the world that cooperate with the FBI or the DEA, they will get information from the NSA indirectly and never be told it's coming from that, but they can act on that. And then when they do, they have to create their own, what they call parallel construction to to create information that's admissible in a court. Since the NSA data wasn't collected with a warrant, it can't be admitted in court. So, or it's inadmissible. So they have to do a parallel construction, then, which means go find the kind of implicating information that would give probable cause to do what you're doing, arresting them, and do it through normal policing procedures. Then we'll use that data in court, substitute for the NSA data, so they perjure themselves there in court. And I call that a planned program perjury policy run by the Department of Justice of the United States. And now they're spreading it around the world, so they're subverting our judicial system inside this country also, and they're not just doing it here, they're spreading it around the world. So, well, you know, we all need to be concerned about this around the world, not just here in the United States. We may have started it, but off the model of the Soviet Union and the Stasi, I might add, and but we're spreading it, and that's even more criminal in my mind.
Bill, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in central western Pennsylvania, up in the hills, up in the Appalachia Hills. So I'm a genuine hillbilly, so to speak.
What value was placed on honesty, hard work, integrity, and character in your upbringing?
Well, in this town, I mean, you know, it was only 3,200 people at the time. I think it's down to 28 now, 2,800. At the time, you know, everybody basically knew everybody else. So what you were was what constituted your character. And so everything you did reflected on the character of person you were. And that's how people knew you in the town. So everything, all the values, the decency and all on that people treated each other with were all part of that growing up. And people cared for one another there. They looked after each other. So they were the basic values of humanity. So.
Well, they're the basic values of community. You were brought up around honest people in rural Pennsylvania, and then you moved to D.C. and you got a job in government. Did you find out that your ideas growing up were somewhat naive compared to how things are?
Well, actually not initially anyway. So, I mean, the first 28 or 30 years I was in government, I was of course working the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. That at the time was the highest priority problem that and the highest priority threat that we perceived as a country. So basically, anything I always treated people the same way I did. I was treated when I grew up. So I was always also working on the most important problems in the place. So I didn't really have recognized any change in that, because people really return the kinds of what you project to people, they kind of project back to you. So I didn't perceive of anything at that point to do anything. Besides, everybody in the country and in the NSA wanted me to continue doing what I was doing because I was kind of successful at it. So they liked the outcome, gave clear knowledge of what the potential foes were doing. So they wanted that to continue. It was only in the later part of my career there, from about 1995 on, when I started getting involved with contracting and the shift from the problem that I had been working Soviet Union and so on, that I got into areas where people were getting lots of money in contracts, and so solving problems in that arena was also my objective, because that was the main problem that we were facing, was the digital explosion at the time. So that got me directly into the solving problems that nobody really wanted solved there. And so when I did that, that kind of caused reactions that I didn't think I would get. I thought people would adopt those solutions and run with them and try to improve on them if they could, which was an expectation that I was clearly disappointed at, because no one really wanted to do that. In fact, they still don't, because again, they're still building their empire with different fear-mongering topics. The latest, of course, is cybersecurity and so on. So,
and problem solving is a way of finding truth. So my question would be, what value does philosophy have in your life, and how would you define truth?
Truth, you could say there's a variation of truth depending on who's looking at it, but there's also a physical truth. And that physical truth is or is not. So there's kind of when you look at, for example, when you're doing signals intelligence, you're looking at abstract things, the communications of people and their metadata and other kinds of things that they're saying. You may not be able to read their things, so they may be encrypted and you can't read that. So you have to try to interpret that. But underlying all of that is a physical reality that's happening. Now, either that physical reality is happening or it's not, and that's the truth of it. So what you're trying to do in the business of intelligence anyway is get to that underlying truth, the physical reality, and it's not something like for example, in 1968, the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia. That's a basic fundamental truth. That happened, and it's not open to interpretation. We've got the pictures from Life magazine, and we had all the intelligence of them and everything going in. So it wasn't something that was it was the basic bottom truth, and that's the kind of thing you try to get to, a reliable physics of things that are going on, and basically things that no one would dispute, I would say.
How would you define freedom?
Freedom is, I would say, is when an individual feels that they have the opportunity to try and do anything they want to do. That's kind of the freedom, without hurting people, of course. You have to have limitations. You don't want to do things that will hurt other people, but you have the freedom to be creative and innovative in your own way, in your life, and take it wherever you want to take it.
What's the relationship between freedom and truth? Bringing it together, you actually go out and find truth. There's a relationship between freedom and truth, and when truth is lost, freedom does what?
The problem is when you lose truth, you get into realms of deception and manipulation, and that is what destroys freedom. I mean, you can't really say you're free if you're being manipulated and being given false information to make judgments on. So you're fundamentally in the form of an electorate. You're an uninformed electorate or a disinformed electorate. So you lose your freedoms at that point.
You made sacrifices in order to do the right thing in a hard situation where other people were being dishonest. The cost is so high. How do you justify the sacrificing of your career to do some truth-telling?
That's pretty easy to me. I mean, I look at it as a very simple thing. This is the founding principles of this country, which I thought were really great, and I devoted my entire life to protecting and ensuring that would continue. And internally the oath of office is to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And now the real threat, the only threat we really faced were really domestically. If we had a domestic, we could change, we have done to ourselves fundamentally what the terrorists wanted done but could never achieve. We have done to ourselves. And this is the domestic threat that our constitutional and the oath of office that we took was given to prevent. I mean, this is the only way no other country in the world could have done to us what we have done to ourselves. And so this is the time when all good Americans need to stand up and oppose this.
What is signals intelligence, and how did you get into analyzing data that comes from signals intelligence?
Well, I got into the signals intelligence business in the Army when I got out of school in '65. They were drafting people for the Army, and people in my neck of the woods, hillbillies were good shots with a gun, so you were always a bunch of hunters up there. So you ended up in everybody I knew at the time was ending up in a rifle company being sent in the front lines to Vietnam to be able to kill people. So that was something I didn't want to do. I didn't particularly care to kill anybody. I mean, I didn't even like hunting that much, so I stopped when I was 16. I would never consider wanting to kill somebody as something I really wanted to do, so I wanted to avoid that anyway. I could, so I checked my options with the recruiters, and they said, well, hey, if instead of being drafted for 2 years, you volunteer for 4, we can give you your choice of assignment. You get you get a career. You can go a different route. You don't have to be in the rifle companies, but you have to sign up for 4 years. So I did that, and they sent me to intelligence school, traffic analytics school in Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and that got me in. That was in the Signals Intelligence. That was the Army Security Agency, which is one of the branches of the CSS, of NSA CSS. It's NSA Combined Security Services. That's the Combined Security Services of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine components of Signals Intelligence. That's why the director of NSA is military, because he oversees all of that. So I got into that way, and that's how. And Signals Intelligence basically is looking at how the comment side. It really Signals Intelligence breaks down into 2 parts: communications intelligence and what they call ELINT, electronic intelligence. Communications is simply people communicating, however they do it, whether it's with microwaves or with radio or telephone or emails or any way people communicate. That's communications intelligence. That's that you collect that information to try to analyze what they're doing and figure out what their intentions and capabilities are. That's what the intelligence community is supposed to do. On the ELINT side, that's kind of radars, where is a flying object, or where is a ship at sea, or telecommunication, the telemetry with satellites and things and missiles, and how are they operating and what are they developing. So that's that kind of intelligence, like machine talking to machine. That's that kind of intelligence. So that's how SIGINT breaks down.
How many years did you spend in the Army before you joined NSA?
I was 4 years in the Army, and then I went I got out of the Army in '69 and started in 1970 at NSA. And I was with them till 2001, so almost 32 years.
So you have about 36 or 37 years total service, 32 years approximately at the NSA, based around the analysis of data. Can you talk a little bit about the analysis of data as a discipline or a science or an art form, and the importance of automation these days?
I looked at this was one of the problems I saw with the field of analysis. Period. Whether it was in NSA, CIA, or anywhere else. The point was it was variable by the analysts looking at it. That is, there was an underlying truth. It was just that other analysts wouldn't necessarily end up with the same result given the same input. That is, they wouldn't necessarily be able to see as far into the reality of what was happening as there would be varying views of that depending on the analyst you went to. So you get a distributed outcome across a spectrum of interpretations of the same data. To me, that was simply incompatible with what the analysis discipline should be. And so I started in 1985. I started working at NSA in a way to try to automate that process. Now, that meant you had to put together the basic understanding of how analysis operates. So you build rules of how to look at data, how to analyze data, how to put data together, and construct an argument that would show a given implication from that input, and be consistent and optimal. That is, if someone else had a better rule or a way to approach the data, you would look at that, take that in, and see if that was true, then you would incorporate it. So you were basically assembling and accumulating knowledge of the process and knowledge for a discipline that would cut across all agencies in the U.S. government as well as other governments around the world. So basically, I was the only one automating the analysis to that extent, try to make it. Others would do data preparation kind of automation, that is correlating data that should be packaged together and then presenting it to an analyst to look at. Whereas I would say that that's simply the first step. The automation process then needs to continue beyond that to take that information and begin to understand what that means and begin to build interpretations and, in fact, in many cases, even write reports completely without human intervention. And do it with a discipline that was consistent, accurate, and reliable. So that was my thrust at NSA. In fact, I was the only one there doing that kind of thing.
What is relationship mapping, and how is it useful in taking raw data and making it, information?
Well, I think there's a little history to this. Maybe should go into a little bit of the history here.
Absolutely.
Because this is not unique to this time and age. Actually, it goes back many years. You can go back even to the Revolutionary War. But I like the case in Washington when I think it was the Pinkertons figured out the Confederate spy ring in Washington, D.C. simply by watching people visit other people. So they built up a relationship ring just by visitors, who visited who. And so that laid out their network. And then, they didn't call it social networking then, they just called it mapping the spy network. Then in World War I, when Manuel Morris, I believe at that point became the primary communications system for all the field armies in the European war. Then they called it net reconstruction, where you'd have call signs being used by military formations calling one another, and you would use those call signs as relationships to put back together the entire military structure of the opposing armies. And then you could watch them move around, and you could see how they were preparing things for like an offensive, even before they started the artillery bombardment. So you could see those kinds of things too. And then later on, and after World War II, they did the same kind of thing there with many different means of communications, air to ground, as well as ship to ship, ship to shore, and ground to ground. So those kinds of communications helped them lay out the communications networks for the opposing armies and the Nazis and Japanese. But and for example, it also gave them acquired data that they could break for the Enigma, or in the JN-25, in the case of the Japanese JN-25, or the purple codes. So those kinds of things gave them that information to be able to defeat them. It made a big difference on the battlefield. So, but today, and at that time, they started calling it contact chaining. So, and it was still network reconstruction, but also in the form of contact chaining. A calls B, A calls C. So that's how you put back together your network. And the same today is done, except now they call it social network reconstruction. So here's your social network. You phone you phone your mother, you phone your daughter, you phone your friends, your business partners. You go to work and you telephone the same people, but in different directions. So you get all those things into a network, and that's called your social network. And the same then applies to the internet, who you communicate with, or on Facebook, who you communicate with, and so on, or any communications means or media. It also applies to financial transactions, when you use credit cards or write a check or pay a bill electronically. All those account-to-account transactions are a network for financial operations for you. And the same is true with travel. If you're going overseas, your passport number's identified, where you're going, what planes you get on, when you leave, when you arrive, all that's laid out, and that shows your travel network.
So in the past, it was social network reconstruction, where they would try to figure out who you're friends with and this sort of thing. And today, it's voluntary self-surveillance, do-it-yourself surveillance, by just putting on your Facebook or your Twitter. Or they don't have to actually come. It's more of they can play defense because they don't have to be on offense. We're giving them the information. They just have to collect it and analyze it and predict our movements. Right.
And actually, they can take your address book off your internet or off your computer and lay out your whole network there using that data too. And that's been one of the recent ones there. But I mean, they don't even have to attack your computer. If you allow yourself to be open, they can get that information easily.
Bill, if we're the targets today, let's compare it and contrast to the NSA in the 1970s. Who were your targets back then? And what were your daily activities back then?
Okay, well, at the time, the bulk of NSA was focusing on foreign threats. So they didn't know about the Minaret program. What NSA does is they compartmentalize programs so that only very few people know about them or involved in them. And so there was a small percentage of people at NSA that were involved in program Minaret. So the vast majority of people there didn't know it was happening. And their activities were fundamentally trying to analyze the communications of foreign countries or foreign governments and militaries, and to try to assess potential adversaries' threats and so on. I mean, the main focus again was at that time in 1970 was on the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact as the preeminent kind of threat that we were facing. But also we had efforts against Red China, North Korea, Cuba, and various other countries around the world that were borderline potential threats. So that it depended. I mean, you had a national priority list for intelligence production, so you would follow that primarily as your targeting for effort that you would devote in terms of signals intelligence. So it was the national intelligence, the SIGINT national SIGINT requirement lists were developed from national requirements for intelligence based on the view of the U.S. government of other governments and militaries and or terrorist organizations and things like that around the world.
How about in the 1980s? Who was the NSA pointing its barrel at? Who were the targets? Was it the Soviet Union still during the Cold War, or who?
Yeah, during the Cold War, it was still the primary ones were the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, China, and North Korea were the primary ones. But over time, that was changing. There were some terrorist activities early in the Reagan administration in Lebanon, for example, and others. So there was raising that as another issue. So they're starting to look at terrorism as an issue, and so there was a little shift starting there. But still, primarily, they were focused externally at foreign threats. And after the Church Committee investigations, the Minaret program was terminated, and so the FISA law was enacted, and they adopted the program Blarney, I think, as a result of the FISA laws, and that was, again, they were very sensitive at that point from there on about any collection of U.S. citizens. I mean, if you happened to have some data collected about a U.S. citizen, right away you had to review it as whether or not it was a violation of the FISA law, and either way you had to purge the data from the base. So we were very sensitive at that time about that.
So after the Church Committee, the FISA courts, those are protections put in to protect the individual rights of people in this country. We call them citizens. In 1992, John Taggart led a problem-solving team to combine ops and research to capture and diagnose data. Could you describe the substance and nature of what that project was?
Actually, it was a joint. Dr. Taggart came from research. He was the chief of staff of the research area over there, and he came in. Actually, I met him first in 1985 when we started cooperating there to do automation of SIGINT processes. So the analysis was the driving factor of that. So we were working together from 1985 to about 1982 when we said with the explosion of the digital world and digital communications, why we felt that at that time we had to formalize the kind of loose cooperation we've been doing together since 1985. So we started jointly the SIGINT Automation Research Center. John came from research, and so he brought all the technical skills, computer processing people, engineers, even physicists or other people who had the technical skills from the technology area. And I came from operations, so I had the operational skills like linguists, analysts, crypto mathematicians, cryptanalysts, and so on. So I'd bring all that into that effort too. So we had all the skills at NSA kind of in a small area. It was only about 16 people total. And so we were all in one place. And so it made it much easier to attack problems, because what you would do to get together, now here's the problem we want to attack, and you define that problem for everybody. And we'd say, here is your component of that problem, and here's yours, and here's yours, and here's how you all have to work together to solve the problem to get the end result. So everybody would know their part in what the effort was. They would know what they were contributing, who they had to work with, and what the end result was, so they knew the entire process from beginning to end. And it made it gave that understanding, having that understanding in the people developing it, made it so much easier to integrate and so much quicker to solve. And so that was the whole idea of the SIGINT automation. It's like a skunk works or a Saturn plant, for example, how you can quickly solve the problem and do it effectively.
What's the right way to use spying to protect freedom and liberty? In other words, what should be done, and how can we be protected and still, do the job of collecting the intelligence we need?
Yeah, what we did was we looked at it as we had to satisfy all the legal requirements under the FISA laws and all the other laws that existed, plus abide and protect the constitutional rights of every citizen of the United States. At the same time, we wanted also to be making our analysts effective against foreign threats. That meant getting and focusing in on a rich environment of information to ensure that would happen. I mean, if we buried them in data, they were already buried in data when we started this program, and they were malfunctioning at that time, and they were complaining about that, and all they were doing was coming in with more and more tools for them to use to look at data. That didn't solve the problem of all the massive amount of data that they had to look at, and the ways that they were going at it. They were going at it from a Google type approach where you use a series of words or a phrase or something to go at, and many people use those phrases that aren't even related or involved in any activity that was of concern. So what that did was bury them under a pile of useless information, even in the 90s. So the question was how to solve that problem and do it effectively, so that we, followed all the rules of law and also abided the constitutional rights and made a rich environment for our analysts to look at, to analyze, and become much more effective in their jobs and their responsibilities and what they're attempting to do. So that's what our whole program that out of the SIGINT Automation Center was all about, and that's what we tried to do, and that's effectively what we did. And we did it by doing a focused, targeted approach in terms of the graphing of relationships, social networks. We would build the social networks of the bad guys and also look at the social networks that were being passed as data was passing by, so that we could see whether or not someone was a part of that network or not. If they were not, we simply let everything pass right by. So that meant that gave privacy not only to U.S. citizens, but to everybody in the world. And that made a rich environment then of data for analysts to look at. And on top of that then, if we found that someone in the United States, assumed U.S. citizen, was in way cooperating or communicating with some terrorist organization or member of a terrorist organization overseas, we would initially, when we picked them up, we would encrypt all the attributes that identified them, so that basically they would be anonymized. And but you could still track them and follow what they were doing, because it was unique anonymization, so that meant we could track them but still not be able to tell who they were until we would develop probable cause. At that point, then we would say we would get a warrant, and then we would be authorized to target them and take in their data. If that we didn't have a warrant, we simply would terminate that activity after, I think it was 3 days, 72 hours. You had 72 hours to get a warrant to do that.
In 1997, what was your position at NSA?
I was the technical director of what I call the world. I was the technical director of the intelligence production of the comment side of the NSA, which basically encompassed the entire world. It was an operation of about 6,000 people, and they were analysts and linguists and reporters of all the material collected by NSA for militaries, governments, whatever in the world. So that was where I was then. That's why I got into doing the digital age and solving that problem for NSA.
Well, and from what I could pick up from the story, in the 90s, after you and Ed Loomis had worked for Taggart, Loomis took over his position, and some of the things or some of the projects or components that you guys had worked on were brought together into something called ThinThread. Now, could you talk about how it was supposed to be an automated analysis of the network log, why that would have worked, and why, because it worked, it wouldn't be accepted?
Okay, that was a separate proposal we had made to automate the network log, analyzing the network log. That we did, and actually we did it when we formed the SIG and Automation Research Center. Is one of the first things we wanted to do, and that was everything that anybody does on a computer or on a network in NSA or anywhere else gets logged in the network log. So if you click a mouse and it sends a set of instructions down the network to a point where you are going to get data or something, that gets logged in the log. So we wanted to put together an automated process to analyze the log in near real time to be able to say what people are doing on the network as they did it. So in other words, if somebody came on the network and started to download all kinds of files, we would pick that up within milliseconds of it happening. And after a point alert to that, and for example, Snowden, if we had had that in process online, we wanted to monitor everybody in the world, so we would have included Snowden or anybody in the world, anywhere in the world, who was coming on the NSA network. If they came on and started to do something, we would know about it and be able to learn about it. So if that would have been running, Snowden couldn't have done without what he did without being picked up almost immediately.
But if that were running, and Snowden wouldn't have had to blow the whistle in the first place, because the integrity of the NSA would be preserved through that program, which could monitor the budgets and all sorts. Go ahead, Nick.
And we ran into two problems, two camps of opposition to that. The first one were the analysts. Because once you start monitoring what the analysts are doing on the network, you know how they're operating. You can say, this analyst needs some training in this area because they're not quite doing the problem right, or this analyst has an idea that worked and we need to spread it around, so we'll take advantage of that. And that group of analysts said, we do not want you monitoring us. We'll do our job. Thank you. You just go about your business and don't pay any attention to us. So, but that was not the major group that opposed us. The major group were all the managers. And the reason they did that was because this will show all the return on investment on every program they're funding, and whether or not programs that are being funded are being successful or not, and whether or not they're contributing. So that would set up a whole process for return on investment assessment for NSA, also for Congress, because that would be evidence for Congress to review in terms of what kinds of funding they would do for the agency. So that meant, plus it took away the freedom that the managers felt they had to move money around and do anything they had with money, because we'd pick that up too. So that said to them, I don't want you monitoring me. I want the freedom to do what I want to do as I want to do it. So go away, and we're not going to do this. So that's why we didn't do that back in the early 90s.
Well, and without audit oversight, fraud and corruption become the status quo.
Yeah, that's the main issue here, that the NSA and CIA and intelligence community in general is not audited. That is, there's no accounting for how they spend the money, how effectively or not. So it's a setup for corruption and fraud and waste.
Volume, velocity, and variety. Asset or liability?
The way we looked at it in the SIG and Automation Research Center was that volume meant you had the opportunity to get more information about your target, simply because there was more of it out there, and velocity meant you got it at the speed of light, so that was good. And variety meant you got many aspects of it. You get voice, maybe video, maybe Twitter, or else email, and all kinds of aspects. So all those things we looked at as positive things. All we had to do was figure out how to manage them.
Let's talk about Thin Thread a little bit and how it at one time protected the rights and privacy rights, especially of American citizens.
Yeah, well, in the data acquisition system, once we acquired information and recognized that maybe a terrorist was talking to a potential U.S. citizen, what we would do is encrypt all the attributes. So that would protect their identities until you could show probable cause. You had a certain time limit to do that. That was automatically managed by the system by software right up front. So that as data, if data was just about U.S. citizens, the software would simply let it pass right by. It would never be ingested into our system. So it had to be that targeted set of individuals that we were after, and maybe 2 degrees, we were going to expand that to the 2 degrees around it as the zone of suspicion in the social network. Otherwise, we wouldn't even take in the data. And that would be filtered by software upfront as as that data was viewed. It's much similar to what Naris and the Variant devices for AT&T and Verizon can do today.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's in the next line of thinking is February 2001, AT&T and Verizon get these pieces of paper from the government saying, we want your customer data. AT&T used something called a Naris device, and I'm sure there's an equivalent device at Verizon. I'm not sure what it's called.
It's Variant, yeah.
And what do these devices do specifically? And this was, again, February 2001, am I correct?
February, Naris didn't, I think, start marketing things till about 2002. Before that, in 2001, early on, they were they were going around soliciting information from different telecommunications companies. The one we know about that is in court record is Quest. Nacho was the CEO of Quest at the time. Refused to turn over all of their data. This they approached him on the 27th of February, according to the court records of 2001, which was about 7 months before 9/11. So they were approaching them before 9/11 to get all of their data, all of their customer information. So the intent that was kind of implied, the intent was to get information on U.S. citizens even before 9/11. The key point about when they were approached is that we had proposed to deploy our system in November of 2000, just 3 or 4 months before they made this approach to Quest. Because we had everything connected and everything was functioning all the way back through the big-ass graph, if you will, the bag, or the social networking for everybody that was ingested, and we had projected at the time we had no limit as to how many trillions of transactions we could take in, that we could still manage them with this process that we put together. The idea was if you took in trillions of relationships, that like phone calls between people, but when you boiled it down to, you would only get tens of billions of maybe relationships uniquely, and that all the others would simply be repeats of those tens of billions of relationships. So we would put together a system that would build the relationship and then keep a counter of how many times we had a record of that relationship, rather than keep the entire list of, if we saw something 1,000 times, we would simply have it once and say we saw it 1,000 times, as opposed to listing it 1,000 times. So that's how we could boil it down to a small set of information and keep it in a rather compact set of storage. And that's how we projected we could graph everything, every transaction in the world that way, so that we didn't have a problem with storage, and we didn't see a limit as to how much we could graph, and we used it and put it together in a B plus tree type index, which meant we had fast access to it to make decisions as data was passing by on whether or not we should keep that data. So that's how we fundamentally did it, using a B plus tree kind of index query to keep up with the velocity of things in the fiber network. And any time we started to get pressed in terms of CPU time or processing, we would simply add another processor and simply split the process and make it manageable again. So it was only a matter, the only thing that kept us from doing any amount of data was how much space and power do you have available, and we can buy the equipment to make that happen.
So prior to 9/11, AT&T and Verizon had complied with the government. This pre-9/11 collection of data means that the post-9/11 surveillance of the American citizens has nothing to do with 9/11 so much as they just wanted control, and they wanted to break into these fiber optic networks, and AT&T, Verizon, they complied, and Joseph Naccio from Quest said no. What happened to him?
He ended up in jail. I think they went at him. He claims he was framed. I don't doubt it because they attempted to frame me too, except they didn't succeed. I mean, I had evidence to show that it was a frame job and that it was malicious prosecution on their part, but evidently he couldn't do that. So he ended up in jail. I don't know for many couple of years, I think. So he recently got out of jail. I think that simply meant that they used 9/11 as the way they could intimidate Congress into making it happen, to allow them to do that, and that's the way they did it. Originally, they had to keep it so secret because they knew they wouldn't be permitted by Congress or the courts to do it if they didn't keep it secret. So they allowed only 4 members of Congress to know about it. That were the chairs and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. That was it. And those people bought into it. One of those was Nancy Pelosi. She later became Speaker of the House, and since she bought into all these programs, these programs were the grounds of impeachment for Richard Nixon. Except he was doing an infinitesimal amount compared to what's going on now, and he was impeached for that. So they all knew the dangers here, and they all tried to put together a mask of having the president authorize it and having the attorney general say it's legal, and keeping all that documentation secret out of the courts and away from the courts, so that nobody could challenge it. Nobody even knew it was happening. And that's why I started to blow the whistle at that time, because I went to the House Intelligence Committee staffer that I knew, Diane Rourke, and told her what was going on so that she would be aware. I mean, that committee was formed, and their charter was to ensure that this kind of activity did not happen. And so that's where I went first.
So just to summarize, prior to 9/11, the NSA was collecting billions of phone records on American citizens without probable cause, that they had kind of planned on doing this from the beginning, and then they used 9/11 as an excuse to really ramp that up. Is that accurate?
I think they were, the approach to Nacho would imply that they were planning on doing it before 9/11. What they did was they used 9/11 as the excuse or the basis for implementing it. That is, I didn't know that it was implemented until the second week in October of 2001. So that was after a little over a month after 9/11 had happened. So they started taking in that data at that time, and I only knew about it because the people who had worked for me to put together that system were the ones they had to use to set it up for Stellar Wind program, the domestic spying program. So they were the ones they had to use, and so they used them to do that. They would implement the code, make sure the code was functioning, and the inputs would come in and it got processed properly. They were the only ones who knew the code sufficient enough to be able to do that. And so once they started ingesting data, they saw the data coming in. It was all about U.S. citizens, roughly. From AT&T, it was roughly averaged around 320 million records of long-distance phone calls between U.S. citizens inside the country every day. That didn't count all the other communications they were managing too, but the domestic spying started with that, and then of course it branched out to other telecoms, and then they spread out. The only 2 things that the telecommunications companies had to offer, one was all the records of the phone calls and transactions that their customers were doing, and the other was access to the fiber lines. And giving that access to fiber lines allowed the NSA to use NARIS devices and other kinds of devices to tap into the networks and take, for example, all of the communications in the fiber optic lines for the World Wide Web. That's part of what Mark Klein exposed in the AT&T facility in San Francisco, was the NSA room where they had the NARIS devices operating in off the fiber lines that AT&T was managing. What they would do was, as Mark would explain, is simply put basically a prism on the fiber line, which would split the fiber into 2 equal parts. They would send one the normal way and then one to the NSA room.
Now that prism's basically a beam splitter?
It's basically a beam splitter. We call it a splitter or a Y connector.
Sure. So optically, they're taking one stream of fiber optic data, they're splitting it into two, they're capturing one, delivering you the other that you don't know is being spied on.
Right.
And they have had this ability for, since last century, basically.
Yes. Actually, that capability goes back quite a ways. Using it effectively inside the United States started after 9/11. So, and that was what Mark Klein exposed, and there are between 80 and 100 other similar tapping points inside the fiber network, inside the United States, in the Fairview program alone. In other programs, they have other tapping points with not with Shamrock, but Stormview is another program, and then Blarney is another. So that those, and I'm not sure the extent of those. There is one slide on Stormbrew that shows tapping points along the periphery of the U.S., which would imply they're after the transoceanic cables when they come up, which would imply that program is looking primarily for foreign communications, whereas Fairview looks much more like it's directed domestically.
Stellar Wind was one of these programs. Did it start prior to 9/11? And it's also a collaboration with GCHQ as well, where they're collecting information without probable cause and sharing it with other countries. Is that correct?
The Stellar Wind program was named, I think, in October of 2001 as their domestic spying program. That's when the data started coming in.
So right after 9/11, they said, we have a program for this. It's called Stellar Wind, and we just pulled it out of our pocket. It wasn't created before 9/11.
Right. That's right. And also it wasn't shared with the British at that time. Although I think there's much more sharing going on now and more cooperation with law enforcement as well. Sharing this kind of program, and they have similar programs in England, at least some of the stuff that Snowden materials come out saying the same thing, that they're doing that too. That's why I say this program, this kind of approach is spreading, and we're kind of the ones leading the way electronically. I think the British were doing it visually with the cameras and looking at their countrymen and monitoring what they were doing with the cameras before we were. Mm-hmm. But we started the electronic spying, and then now they're also joining us in that effort. I think we were much further ahead with them in doing that, in the graphing area especially, in indexing area, and managing information. So I think they've adopted our techniques.
So some of the relevant information pertaining to what the NSA had prior to 9/11 consists of communications that they've sniffed and stored and analyzed in some way. Was the NSA aware, or did it have in its databases the traffic that would have told us this attack is going to happen, and if so, what are the details?
Yes, although I don't see Tom Drake, who is a friend of mine, also a supporter of our program, ran that program on the entire NSA database after 9/11, several months afterward, and he found all the data that was necessary to stop 9/11 in their database sitting there that people didn't recognize or bring to anybody's attention or report in any form to anybody of authority. What that meant was that it got back to the unreliability of analysts being able to see through mounds of data. Right, you make them dysfunctional by putting all that data on top of them and making them sift through it. And so they first of all, it's only humans can only do so much, and obviously there was just too much there for them to handle. That's why they needed an automated process going through it, and they didn't have that. They rejected that entire process. That's getting back to why I keep saying they traded the security of everybody in the United States and the free world for money, because they wanted to. Money was the issue, not solving the problem.
So potentially NSA could have connected the dots prior to 9/11, stopped the terrorists from ever infiltrating the country, but they didn't have enough budget money, or they didn't focus that budget money on the appropriate projects. Which do you think it is?
Actually, it had nothing to do with the budget. They had plenty of a budget to do it. They didn't need any more money to make that happen. See, that was the issue. The issue was they wanted to build the budget up. So they wanted more money. So you don't do anything that would take away the problem that you're using to get more money. So you stop that and keep the problem going is the issue, right? So you still have a problem, therefore I need more money, so you get a bigger budget. if they say, well, let's implement this other program that solved the problem, well, then they don't have that problem to argue for money. So, and that's basically the way they viewed it and the way they operated, and a lot of contractors got rich off of it.
Did you ever brief the CIA on what the NSA had on these terrorists prior to 9/11? So you would have briefed them after 9/11 and said, hey, here's what we had and here's what could have been known. Did that ever go on?
You see, I left NSA in October of 2001, so any of the data that was run and pulled out by Tom Drake, he did after I left. So I couldn't brief CIA on that, but what I did do with Ed Loomis and Kirk Wiebe, we went through open source data in 2002 and pulled together all the material that was there, including the names of the targets of the terrorists. They had names for the targets, like the towers, the Twin Towers were called Town Center. The Capitol building was called Law, and the White House was called Fine Arts. And so they talked about these. These were the codes they used for the targets in emails and things that they had said. And we got this out of open source off the web using Google. So we did brief them on what we were able to pull out of open source, and that was as contractors. We were going in saying, this is what you can do with open source. And we went through that, and I say, how did you ever know all that? And I said, it's right there in open source, you can get it too, So, yes, we did brief them on that, but it was from open source material, not from anything that NSA had.
That's good to clarify. That's just good to clarify that it was from open source material. It was widely available. Right. Let me ask this specific question. Within that data set that was widely, openly available, was the attack date of September 11th, 2001 in that correspondence to be found?
Yes, it was, yeah. In fact, the way they depicted it as we say 9/11, 9th month, 11th day, but they'll say day month. So they would put a line and a line, and then a pi, a circle and a line. That would be 11/9. So the 11th day of September. That was mentioned as one of the date for the event.
What was the response of the CIA when you demonstrated this ability from open source data?
They just couldn't believe that we got that information out of open source. They couldn't believe that it was there. That's all.
Did the FBI have access to that data as well?
At the time, I don't think at the time they did. I mean, NSA had that kind of information, so they didn't share that kind of data, which they, of course, should. I mean, if that kind of information came to me when I was in the SIGINT Automation Research Center, if they didn't want to report it, I would pick up the gray phone, which is the encrypted phone for the U.S. government, and call somebody at CIA or FBI and say, here's what I have, take action on it, will you? I can't seem to get it out of my place. They don't want to report this, but here's what it is. I mean, you do those kinds of things when those kinds of important things. You don't care what your management says because this is just too important. You do those kinds of things. But there's very few people there. Most NSA employees would say, okay, we won't do that.
I asked about the FBI because they are in the unique position of being law enforcement and intelligence. And so a lot of times they sit in the middle and seem to play both sides of that identity game.
Yes, they do, yeah. Yep.
How is the USA Patriot Act a metaphorical Christmas list for the intelligence community and what they had planned to do, and now they're able to do it? Can you explain that process?
It's only possible by a secret interpretation of that act. The act does not say you can take up or take bulk acquisition of information on U.S. citizens from all communications or any other means from business records of anything. It simply says in there that you have under Section 215 in the business records section, it says you can pursue investigating anything that's relevant to a terrorist investigation or dope smuggling, international dope smuggling, or anything like that. It doesn't say you have the right to take in everything and then try to sort it out later, which is the secret interpretation. The secret interpretation is not just relevant, it's potentially relevant. So that means everything. That's the way they interpret it. That's their secret interpretation. That the words don't say that, but that's the way they're using it.
So you're talking about Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act. There's a secret interpretation. There's a secret court. How is this different than what went on in the Soviet Union that you used to fight against in the 70s and 80s?
Well, it really isn't. I mean, it's pretty much everything's determined in secret by a central government. That's the policy is set by the central government. Everybody toes the line. Follow the orders of the central government. It's like following orders except that defense went out with Nuremberg, legally anyway.
What is cast iron in relation to Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act?
Cast iron is separate. It's a separate thing. That means that the Section 215 simply says they're going to take in everything in bulk, all business records, so they've got records on everybody. If you get declared a cast iron target, that means they're going to go specifically at you for everything and manually review what you are doing, what you are saying, or any actions or movements you're making. So you will be specifically looked at by people, and not just processes, but by people. So it's a greater degree of focus of an intelligence effort against you and everything you do.
Well, and the purpose of them collecting everything we do is to make predictive models. And again, it goes back to population control, as you mentioned, not in the number of people on the planet, but controlling and being able to do that through the manipulation of their data and understanding their actions before they even take them. When you have such a large set of metadata being collected, isn't that just asking for them to encapsulate the skills of someone like yourself and put that into artificial intelligence so that they can have Bill Binney, even when Bill Binney doesn't want to work there anymore? They have your knowledge encapsulated, and they're able to predictively model people in a way that learns using time series analysis and a bunch of other fancy techniques that basically takes in all this data, and with a high predictability factor, they can tell you what you're going to be doing, what you're going to be eating. And I think some of the places are using this now for commercial marketing to tell, they can predict where you're going to go from your Google searches and whatnot.
Yes, and unfortunately, that's the part that I never left with them. Okay, I never did that for them. So they didn't have that to be able to use it. That's why the President's Big Data Initiative just help us find out what's important in this big data, because they can't do that. And that's really, it gets much more complicated when you when you try to to fuse all the activities of individuals or groups of individuals into from multiple domains like phones and emails and travel and banking, and you try to merge all the activity of everyone in that group or an individual alone. Just trying to do that becomes much more involved and much more complicated and more difficult for them anyway. To index, first you have to get these databases indexed. Each one has a graph. You have to relate the graphs. You got to relate the content and index that and pull it all together and then put it in a timeline and try to make sense of it. How do you assess the interactions of groups of people in a timeline? For example, if you're looking at dope smuggling, the person in, say, Colombia wants to sell dope to somebody in the United States. They have to make a connection to agree on the sale. Then the person has to agree on the price, right? And then they have to transfer the money, and they've got to transport it from Colombia up to the United States. So there's all kinds of transactions that have to occur. All those kind of interactions happen in the communities that they're building, and you have to be able to recognize that. Well, how can you recognize that, right? That's the key too. They can't do that either yet, not yet by any means. So they're struggling with that. They're struggling just to find out what's important in the data, let alone put together and analyze the profiles and what's important in the profiles. We call that profiles of interest is what we call that. We never documented it for them, so they can't do it. But we defined it for them as combinations of things that would imply there is intentions and capabilities to perform certain acts, like dope smuggling, arms smuggling, an attack, any kind of thing like that. For example, the 9/11 crowd did a typical military attack profile. They showed that the military profiles will simply be the military moves to positions to prepare for the attack. In other words, there's takeoff positions for the attack. They prepare for the attack by setting up their command and control system, and then they execute the attack from there. But you can see that movement and shuffling to get in position to do that, and that's a pretty typical military action. Well, the terrorists did exactly the same thing. They moved to hotels next to airports and then bought the tickets for the airplanes and then got on the airplanes simultaneously. So you could see that buildup. That was an obvious attack coming.
What are some of the things about 9/11, 13 years later, that disturb you that might not have been investigated properly? Or what are some of the anomalies or things that, are like a splinter in your mind about 9/11?
Well, in the intelligence arena, there's, of course, the inadequate search of the database that NSA did, and after the fact, they found the data and then covering it up and not letting it be exposed to the congressional investigations or the 9/11 Commission, to my knowledge, anyway. So that meant that they didn't have those aspects to deal with and couldn't deal with it in terms of their reports or in their studies. And so, and then there's the physical issues. I've been talking to some physicists recently and engineers and so on, and they have a coalition of people, the 9/11 Truth Group, which is saying there are certain aspects of 9/11, the physical nature of how the things occurred, that should have been addressed by these different studies and have not been. Physical things, observable acts like molten metal in the buildings, coming out of the buildings, and like that certain temperatures physics requires certain temperatures for that to occur, and how you can't get that kind of temperature in a fire in a building like that.
So you can't identify the source of what's causing that.
Right, but that's a physical fact that should have been addressed and dealt with. And also Building 7 falling straight on its footprint, that kind of thing is suspicious. How could a building like that fall that way? And that was not even addressed. So none of those things, or some of the other things they were showing me, were also suspicious that they should have addressed, and they didn't. And so none of the studies came out with those. So that's basically a very bad. Even NIST didn't do that. I mean, that's not good science at all. I mean, you don't ignore facts that don't fit your preconceived outcome. In other words, if I wanted to solve a crypt problem and I had a preconceived idea of how it went there, and any fact that came along about that system that didn't fit my preconceived idea, I threw them away, I would always fail. Never solve any of them.
Was there anything else with 9/11 that got your attention that you thought this is really strange? And with all the budget power that we have focused on defense in this country, that there were multiple layers of failure that kind of coalesced to bring that event about?
Well, I mean, it was on virtually every level. They were all pretty much out to lunch for that attack, and they ignored the basic things that they should never have ignored. Certainly, if I was aware of them, I wouldn't have hesitated in notifying people. But I would do it on the gray phone.
So we had multiple levels of security failures from our intelligence community on 9/11. And where's the list I can find of people who got fired because they didn't do their job?
It will be on a blank sheet of paper. Okay?
It'd be
There's
redacted.
your list. Right. I mean, they all got promoted, I think. They all got elevated to higher positions, and they got more money, and the budgets were increased, tripled, basically. So, I mean, now, if you looked at it from 9/11 on, up till now, I mean, we've spent almost $1 trillion in the intelligence community since that time.
Around November 2001, Thin Thread received a new input. Instead of being focused on surveillance of an international variety and not focused on Americans, it was turned on us. Can you describe that process? And as its creator, is that something you ever dreamed of when you were making it?
First of all, it wasn't called Thin Thread. That was a replicate. They replicated the code and called it Stellar Wind. Okay, that was the Stellar Wind program. Then they started inputting that data into that domestic data into that program. And the program simply looked at data and did what it was supposed to do with data, which is index and graph and pull things together and correlate them and manage them. That was what they. I mean, and all the things we had in Thin Thread that were to protect people and also monitor what people were doing with the data, they eliminated. They removed that from the software. So those restrictions were no longer involved in any of the processing. So that meant they took away any protections that anybody had, U.S. citizen or otherwise. So there were no protections at all then for anybody.
But isn't it okay to take away our protection to give us security?
No, because that's a violation of the constitutional rights of everybody, starting with the First Amendment, where you have the right to free association. By putting together the social network that you have in the phone network or the email network that lays out everybody you're associated with. So the First Amendment doesn't say you have the right to association with anybody as long as NSA knows about it, or as long as the government knows about it. That's not the point. The point is the government was supposed to stay out of your affairs. These are your affairs. That's what the First Amendment was all about. That's what the Fourth Amendment primarily was about. And that's what the Constitution's about.
Bill, can you discuss some of the atrocities committed by the United States government against its own people in relation to the loss of privacy?
Well, I think I would just say that they've gone to any degree to try to silence anybody who's tried to expose any of this in any way, namely the four of us from NSA, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Lewis, Tom Drake, and myself, who tried to discuss this internally with the Congress, as well as members of the Inspector General's office in the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. And when we did that, why, they came at us with everything they had in terms of the FBI pointing guns at us, and also having the DOJ try to indict us on false charges several times, 3 times. In fact, from between 2007 and 2009, the end of 2009, they attempted 3 times to do that, all of which we were able to stop because we had evidence that showed what they were doing, and so they stopped it. Finally, at one point, the last time they said it, that our lawyers, we had a lawyer at the time, he came out and said that he'd been informed by the Department of Justice they were going to indict us on a charge of conspiracy. And so we, of course, I had the evidence for malicious prosecution of that case, so I called up Tom Drake and I told him I knew his phone was tapped by the FBI. So I wanted to make it clear what I was going to do if they did that. And so I read all that information that I had accumulated on evidence of malicious prosecution over the phone to Tom, and I said, make sure your lawyers know about this because we can use this when we go into court. And so that was the end of that conspiracy charge. And the next month later, we got letters of immunity from the same Department of Justice that had tried to fabricate charges to put us in jail. So after that, why, to me, that was the last straw that told me my government was so corrupt there was not much left of it worth saving. So I had to do whatever I could do to expose it and get it out to the people, the Fourth Estate, out to the public, and get outside of government, because obviously all they were going to do was cover up for the crimes they've been committing.
There's been a lot of talk that Snowden, when he blew the whistle, that he actually was a leaker because he didn't go through something called channels. Can you explain to the audience how, after the Church Committee, the proper way to blow the whistle and disclose government malfeasance to the public was set up?
Yeah, especially for the intelligence community, the procedure was to the Church Committee set up the FISA court and the intelligence committees as oversight for the intelligence community. And so that was the path you had to take to do that. So if you had some complaint, you either had the Inspector Generals of the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice, or you went through the intelligence committees, all of which were the proper procedures to follow to file a complaint, which is all that we did. And that's how they came after us for that. And so that's what Snowden saw. He looked at our case. We were called the thin thread crowd at that point, and he saw what happened to us. He also saw what happened to Tom Drake. He got indicted and falsely charged. I mean, they fabricated evidence against him. They took papers that he had at his house, took them back, and they were all unclassified at the top and bottom. That was clearly marked. So all I did was draw a line through that and classified statement there, stamp, and then stamped it classified, top secret or secret, and then charged him with having classified material, which meant that they were framing him they were fabricating the evidence and framing him. And so that was all, that was still the argument that they were saying going into the court trial in 2010. And they were still going to charge him with that, but the defense attorneys had hired Jim Bamford to be a consultant for them, And Jim went out and found almost all of the data that they were claiming was classified that Tom Drake had was already on the web or out there in the public domain, put out there by NSA. And so Jim took all that data into the court, gave it to Judge Bennett, who was trying the case, and said, here's all the data they are charging him with as being classified that they already put out there in the public domain as unclassified. So, I mean, the judge obviously got the very clear impression that they were framing him. In other words, and so, I mean, I felt that they should have been charged with that at that time. That's a felony. I mean, they should have been disbarred. They should have been thrown out of the DOJ. They should have been barred from court, certainly from arguing anything in any of the courts. But none of that happened. All Judge Bennett did was read them the riot act, and they went away, and that was the extent of their punishment.
You explained that there's basically 3 different levels or 3 different sectors of places you could blow the whistle in your position. You could go to the Department of Defense, Inspector General's office. You could go to the Justice Department, or you could go to the Senate Intelligence Committee. Which of those 3 did you choose, or did you explore all 3 options before?
Actually, went to all of them. We went to the Department of Defense Inspector General, the Department of Justice Inspector General, the Intelligence Committee in the House. We even touched on some of the Senate side. We also talked to individual members in Congress that were not on those committees. So we took all the avenues that were available to us under the Constitution and also under the government regulations. And so that's what Snowden looked at, and he said, obviously, when you're blowing the whistle on illegality and criminality and unconstitutional activity of the U.S. government on it, you can't go through normal channels, because all they'll do is come back at you with all the force they have, which is what they did to us. That's what he saw, and that's why he decided to do what he did.
On March 30th, 2011, there was an article talking about, it was the FBI, I think it was Director Mueller, talking about how they could get data on you in the future, of course, because they could surveil you, but they could also bring up the data from the past. So how would they be able to have data on American citizens from the past in a constitutional way?
Well, they wouldn't, obviously, but what he was saying was he had set up a technology database with the Department of Defense, where he could make one query. With one query, he could get all past emails and all future ones as they came in on a person, which meant that he was tapping into the NSA database of collected data off the fiber optic lines of the internet and looking at all the stored emails that they had on a person, and then also putting them out there as a target so that anytime NSA collected any of that data, that it hit their target designator, it would forward it to the FBI. So that's the way they would get all past and all future emails as they came in. And it's blatantly unconstitutional, because it's a collection of everything on the fiber network, all the emails of everybody in the United States.
In contrast to ThinThread, there was a program under NSA Director General Mike Hayden called Trailblazer. Can you compare and contrast the 2 programs, and how is Trailblazer adversely affecting the lives of American people?
Well, Trailblazer is not affecting anything right now because it was a total failure. It didn't produce anything. But that was the program they wanted to use to justify spending all the money for volume, velocity, and variety of data in the digital age, and that was the one they trumped up the justification to get all the money to begin with. That's why they had to kill the program we were doing. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a justification to continue the Trailblazer program. So that's how you get rid of it, and you can then feed the corporations and build their empires as well as your own, and continue that process for a very long time. In fact, one of the contractors that was running some of the programs said, we can milk this program for 15 years. Well, they're pretty much coming up on the 15th year now, and they're still milking it.
The people that were involved in your whistleblowing, the superiors who were violating the Constitution, were they aware that they were violating their oaths of office?
Oh yeah, that's why they had to keep it secret. That's why this is all done in secret, because it was a clear violation of the Constitution, and anybody that would and for example, when they came out, they originally, after they got it started in October 2001, they Admiral Poindexter come out with a quote from DARPA saying, we'd like to start a TIA program, Total Information Awareness Program, that talked about collecting all the data on everybody, which was exactly what they'd already started doing. And they sent him out basically to test the waters to see how the reaction would be to doing that kind of thing. And right away, Congress reacted. People did from around the country. They lobbied Congress to have it canceled and killed. And that's what happened to that. So Admiral Poindexter's program was terminated. They were unfunding the TIA program. What they didn't know was the TIA program was already running at NSA. And it just kept going and getting bigger from that point. They just that simply told them that they had to keep it secret, that they couldn't tell Congress and they couldn't tell the American public what they were doing. So they have to keep it all secret to continue it, and that's exactly the way they went.
The NSA's general counsel at one point was quoted as saying that they don't even need content as long as they have metadata. What's the importance of metadata, and what can people do with it in a surveillance situation?
Well, metadata is like it gives you the big picture of what you're doing. It shows your entire community of who you're interacting with and who you're dealing with in certain issues. If you're in a work environment, it has to do with your work. If you're at home, it has to do, or it does with your family. These are like subsets of your social network. And that shows you the involvement, the extent of involvement that you're involved in. For example, the IRS can look into that database and see if someone is involved with the Tea Party, anybody in the country, they can check that out to see if they're involved with that Tea Party, because they've got all those relationships already tagged and labeled and filed. So it wouldn't be difficult at all to be able to see if they're involved and whether they can make that decision, like I'm sure the people in the IRS did, as to whether or not they wanted to slow roll or delay their getting 501c3 status, which is fundamentally what they did. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things you can do with that kind of data, and it's just a total subversion of the rights of everyone. Plus, it basically makes the entire population of the country feel that they're being watched all the time, which they are, but not physically. You know, that's the point. But that then affects how they then start changing how they operate, and I refuse to do that. I figure I will say everything I have to say out in public, so that if they want to charge me with something, I've said it in public so that everybody can hear it, not just the collectors at NSA or the FBI looking at it.
Can the public resist a tyranny that it doesn't know exists?
Well, that's the whole point. You know, you have to have knowledge of it. You have to have an informed electorate to be able to make a decision politically, and you have to have an informed population for them to make a decision whether or not they want this kind of activity with their government doing this or not. I mean, unless they know for sure. I mean, the government continues to lie that they don't collect content, but they've been doing this all along on everybody that they can possibly get. The Fairview program shows all the tap points that they're using to do that. They're recording all your phone calls. If you're a target, you get transcribed and you're monitored all the time on everything you do and say. And it's all stored and searchable by FBI or DEA or anybody else in the government that they allow access to it. They are accumulating all this metadata on everybody you're related to and storing recordings of everybody else's conversations they can possibly get. So that's how Tim Clementi, ex-FBI agent, could come on CNN right after the Boston bombings and say that the intelligence community and the FBI have ways and means of getting back to a phone conversation that one of the Tsarnaev brothers had with his wife prior to the bombing. Well, the only way you can get back to it is because they've recorded it. And it's stored and indexed, and so they can get back to it and transcribe it. That's how they do that. I mean, that's the data that I'm sure they only have a window of time to look at that data, probably something on the order of a month, 20 to 30 days, perhaps, something like that. It takes a lot of digital storage space to do that, so. But they've certainly got they've certainly had the money to do it, so. And they've according to the Fairview program, they certainly have the tapping points to do it.
What's the role of propaganda in a totalitarian regime?
Well, it's to buffalo the people into thinking something is happening when it's not. It's the narrative of the administration that's in charge that they want the public to believe it, and they use that propaganda, various techniques like repetitive assertions, multiple people saying the same thing, adds credibility, supposedly. and whether or not it's people from the administration, people from Congress, or people from the courts, So getting people in multiple disciplines and multiple levels of the administration saying the same thing over and over and over again gets people over time thinking that that's really true, when in fact it's not.
What can be done to fix the NSA?
We had 21 suggestions that we, the group of NSA whistleblowers, put together to suggest to President Obama. We sent it in to him and also to the members of Congress, also all the members of the EU, because they're involved too. Their countries are involved indirectly or directly in it. So we sent all that into them, and the two main thrusts of that program was, one, they needed to stop bulk collection and do a focused collection on data to begin with. That is, pull nothing into storage except data that was relevant to specific groups of people or within zones of suspicion around them. Everybody else should be given privacy and just let all their data go by. And so therefore you don't need to build Bluffdale or anything like that. You just need to focus on that unique, high-value set of information. Also, you have other rules, for example, that you would use against terrorists. For example, if they have a cell phone or a satellite phone that they're using in the mountains of Afghanistan, you want to look at them to see whether or not they're involved in a terrorist activity or involved in terrorism in one way or another. Or if you have the similar kind of thing happening in the jungles of Colombia or Peru, somewhere in there, well, you might suspect them of being a dope dealer or a member of the FARC, the terrorist group down there. So if you see that, you want to investigate that. So those are the kinds of rules that bring people into the zone of suspicion. But you only bring them in there to that zone and check them out. And once you check them out, you remove them. But otherwise, if you think they're a part of it, then you put them in, but you list all the reasons why you put them in there.
Probable cause.
Exactly. And the point is, you put the name of the people who are, this is the way we were saying it, you put the name of the person who is entering them as a target, and all the reasons they put down for them to be a target. You don't let them just add a name to a watch list or a kill list or anything else without knowing why they're there and who put them there. So that if there's any question at all, you have the way and means to get back to the original input source and challenge, in one form or another, any of the reasons why they put them there. That's a way of checking and balancing and reviewing and ensuring that the list you have was correct and at least reasonably based. Something they don't have today, by the way.
All right, we were talking Borgs and lobotomies. Go.
Borgs and lobotomies, yeah. Yeah, my view of the NSA management structure was it's very similar to the Borg Collective. What they do is you come up through the grades, you get into grade 14 and above, they start doing what I call a cloning process. So that by the time you get to the higher ranks, you're all thinking with one brain cell. That is, if the collective says, here is the procedure, here's where we're going, this is what we're doing, we all adopt that same thought. So it basically says, I'm not interested in creativity or innovation that might disrupt the Borg collective thought. So let's all think with this one brain cell. So I basically took the position that the only way to reform NSA was to give it double lobotomies down to at least 5 layers of management, and then move them off to the side, put them in the corner so they can't disturb anything. So that way you can then take the workforce and do something effective and actually solve the problems and move on. But you have to get rid of the management because they're infected with this mentality of how things work. And I include lawyers in that and everybody at NSA in all levels.
People who say it's legal even though it's unethical, immoral, irrational,
Well, they're claiming it's legal because they got a law passed out of Congress that Congress still doesn't realize that even Sensenbrenner, who wrote the Patriot Act, said, we never intended you to be able to do what you're doing with this bulk collection of business records. Well, I mean, that's the violation of the intent of Congress, right there. The guy wrote the Patriot Act, so and he got it passed on that basis. And everything after that's been a distortion, a secret interpretation of this or that in the Patriot Act and they never come out and tell anybody what they're really doing or what their real understanding or secret interpretation is. That's because they're too afraid. They're cowards. They're hiding behind a secret interpretation applied with a secret court in secret by a secret government. So that's just I just call them cowards for that. Because if they wanted to do that, if they want to change the Constitution, there's a procedure to do that. You put a resolution up, an amendment on the floor of the Congress, get the Congress to pass it, then you circulate it through the states and get 75% of the states to ratify it, then you've amended the Constitution. That's the proper way to do it. That's the way the Constitution says it's to be amended. Instead, they're doing it in secret. So they need double lobotomies. Singles will not do.
Do you have any regrets about blowing the whistle, at least?
No, I don't. In fact, I will do as much as I can, anywhere I can, so as long as I'm able.
I have a couple questions about history, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The American Revolution, what was the logic behind it? Who did we fight and why?
Well, I mean, it came out of our dictator, George III, right? He was over in England ordering his troops to go investigate anybody he wanted, have them break into any home, do anything, take anything they want, and those kinds of, and they were taxing without representation and all that too. So it was basically what a totalitarian state does to its population, anything they want, right? So that was the fundamental reason. And then they had these general writs that they would give to the military, the British military, that they could go around and show at any house, anywhere, or any business, and go in and look around, take whatever they want. So that's a general writ, which turned into be a general warrant. That's why we created the Fourth Amendment to bar governments, even the central government, ours too, which is my primary concern, was that our government could not just have a general writ like the FISA court ordered with the Verizon transfer of data on 110 million plus U.S. citizens without being named or given probable cause or anything else. That was a general written by our FISA court that should be called into court by themselves and individually explain why they did that and what was the reason for it and their justification to do it. They need their day in court instead of doing everything in secret.
NSA spying, how many laws are they breaking every day by doing this to us?
Well, I mean, if you don't count the unconstitutional laws they passed to try to make it legal, then they're violating the pen register law for a total of at least 280 million records a day. I mean, persons a day. So the pen register on 280 million plus people every day is being violated. And you can argue the same for the 150 million or so of people who are on the internet. Then you can also say the Electronic Privacy Act is being violated, the Electronic Security Act, all the FISA regulations that were governing telecommunications companies and any communications company, and all the laws that were behind all of that, plus, of course, all the constitutional amendments, First, Fourth, and Fifth, at least. So, and I'm sure if you looked around, there could be any number of others they're doing too, including cover-up laws for covering crimes up, and they're doing that any number of times, day after day after day. I don't know, it's just too many to count.
How would you describe the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain?
That's the closest international relationship that I know of. I mean, ever since in World War II, of course, we were cooperating together in breaking the German codes, the Enigma code, and also the Japanese JN25 and the Purple codes. Actually, the British did not break the Enigma code. It was the Poles. And there's a story behind that. The Poles, the way they were able to do it, originally the Enigma encryption was started out to be a commercial encryption for business. And it was started by German companies, and the Poles were manufacturing the device. So the Poles, as they were manufacturing the device, every part in that device would be stamped with a number, and they would shift down. The next part would come and get stamped with the next higher number. So they had a trail record of all the devices they were and parts that they were creating. Well, the Poles, as they were doing it, would move the assembly line down one, but not up the counter. So in fact, they would print two versions of the same numbered part, and then they'd take one of them. So that meant that they had the entire Enigma device, a copy of it, and the Germans down at the end copying or checking off all the numbers as they came down, got every number. So they weren't missing any. So they thought they had them all, when in fact the Poles took away one copy of the device. In fact, I believe the Germans, when they invaded Poland in September 1st, 1939, and overran some of the positions, they found some of the transcription or the decryptions of the Enigma device in that process. So they knew they were being read by the Poles. What they didn't know was the Poles then smuggled copies of those devices out to the French and the British. And so the devices came from Poland, and they explained how they were breaking into it and everything to them at that time. And then from there on, they managed the key recovery and decrypting of the messages from then on throughout the war.
And after the war, we continued that special relationship, fighting the Cold War, fighting against the Soviets. Can you describe what it was like?
Well, yeah, it was a continuation. I mean, the Five Eyes were the English-speaking countries, the U.S., Canada, U.K., Great New Zealand, and Australia. That was the Five Eyes group, and we were basically cooperating very closely on breaking codes and intercepting information during World War II, and that simply continued thereafter. So we had this worldwide cooperative effort to do SIGINT around the world, and it evolved into the Cold War. So we went in and changed, and we switched from focusing on the Germans and the Japanese, and focused now on the Russians. So that just simply continued.
What's the relationship between NSA and GCHQ?
Well, I mean, they're fundamentally integrated operations. They share everything they do. So it's like I say, the closest relationship that I'm aware of in the government. Simply because it takes so much effort to be able to break into crypt systems and things like that, and solve problems like that it takes a really close cooperation and coordination. And that's the closest relationship that I know of.
Have you ever heard of Operation Gladio?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, when I left NSA, they were running over 2,000 programs. Each one had their own name. So that's...
Okay, so I'll just take 30 seconds here. Operation Gladio is a joint effort by British and American stay-behind forces in Europe to fight against the Soviets. And so it sounds like a really good reason that we're working together and we're doing that. But Gladio later was morphed into, once there was a nuclear standoff in the mid-60s, it was morphed into a terrorist and black ops network, drug smuggling. And there's a whole, there's like 60-year history of this going on. It's trained by British, funded by Americans. It's a joint relationship that continued after World War II. So I didn't know if that had ever come on your radar.
You mean smuggling dope?
Well, the fact that there was an official way to use black budgets and tax dollars to have these terrorist forces to stir up events so that, it's alien dialectic.
Well, I mean, I know some other cases like programs Watchtower, Pegasus, and Amadeus. Those were programs used during the Reagan administration, where the CIA ran programs to smuggle drugs into the United States, to sell it on the streets of the United States, get money from that, and use that money to buy guns for the Contras in Honduras and fighting in Nicaragua. So I knew they did that. They did similar things, I think, in the Golden Triangle when we were in Southeast Asia. CIA again was ran the planes smuggling the drugs.
A continuity of the British East India Company's opium empire.
I mean, it could very well be. I don't know.
General Mike Hayden had a curious rise to power under George Bush the First. Could you describe that in relation to Iran-Contra and Poindexter and Pegasus, Watchtower, and Amadeus?
I only found that out because I was watching a TV program, the drug war in the United States, the America's Drug War, something like that was the title of it, on PBS, I believe it was. And they were going through the drug war and who was involved, and They got into the Iran-Contra affair and how the CIA was smuggling drugs into the country, and how Admiral Poindexter, I think, took the fall for that. But as a part of his group on the National Security Council was Colonel Michael Hayden. And so I think he was kind of helpful at covering up the activity, as were all of the others involved in it, to cover it up and take the blame and take it away from George H.W. Bush, who was a vice president at the time, former chief of the CIA, who quite clearly, in my mind, got them to do the smuggling of the drugs to get money to finance get the money for guns for the Contras. So there's a direct connection there. So I think that's something that's never really been investigated or come up publicly either. So.
How has Clapper, Hayden, and Keith Alexander deceived the American people with respect to destroying constitutional rights?
Well, they keep lying about what the NSA has been doing. They don't come out and tell them what their secret interpretation is, so that permits them to do what they're doing. They don't come out. They're not honest on any of these fronts. They keep saying, "Well, we don't do content." Well, that's obviously false. Thomas Tam knew that from the DOJ. He could see the evidence of the FBI pulling in that data to use it to get warrants. So, I mean, that was clearly from warrantless wiretaps. So, and the FBI clearly had a warrantless wiretap on us prior to the raids they pulled in 2002. So they aren't being honest about any of that, but they're doing this on everybody. And Mueller testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee in March of 2011 that he had this database to use to get past emails and all future ones as they come in on a person. Well, that's coming out of the NSA collection, out of the Fairview program and other programs. So it's the consolidated databases they're putting together on U.S. citizens. Domestic spying. And they're not being honest about that.
General Mike Hayden recently said that the NSA uses metadata to kill people.
Yep.
Is that an accurate statement? And if so, how is metadata used for the NSA to select their targets? And by targets, I'm assuming they're threats. And what are we a threat to, we the citizens of America?
Well, first of all, to do targeting for the drone strikes or any other strike, they do GPS locations using cell phones and things like that, computers. So you can get the GPS coordinates for you. That's accurate enough for a drone strike. Then they can lock on visually with the drone and then track you once they get that lock on and fire the missile. The problem is they don't verify the target. That is, I can give you my cell phone if I'm a target and say, why don't you take my cell phone and use it for a few days, you know? So you can be out there roaming around with my cell phone. They think you are me because of my attributes on that cell phone. And so if they're going to run a strike at that time, you get hit, I don't. So they need to verify the target before they do the strikes. And the second objection I had to it was what's called in their terms a double tap. A double tap means once you do a strike with a drone or with a gunship, like in the gunship murders in Iraq with where they killed all those people with the helicopter gunship standing off a mile or so, shooting without any problem. I mean, they said they thought they had guns, but they clearly didn't. I mean, I looked at the film too; they didn't have guns. But the double tap principle simply says, in both cases, once you do the strike, wait for people to come in. When they come in, then you fire the next one and do the strike again. What it means, they have the basic assumption that anybody comes to help a terrorist, it must also be a terrorist, so kill them too. That's like that fellow who was driving along, saw this one fellow bleeding on the road, stopped, got out, tried to help him, put him in his car, take him to the hospital or something, and they shot him and his kids in the car. That's the same thing. I call that random slaughter. That's not a disciplined intelligence process at all. I mean, that's just slaughter.
The NSA collects metadata on citizens. It then selects targets and then could call upon a drone. Has that process ever led to the drone strike killing of an American citizen?
It has overseas with Alaki and his son, but not in the United States. I think there was one other one too, but I can't remember the name. But that has been done, yeah, in Yemen.
So they're allowed to hit U.S. citizens as long as we're not in the country?
Well, that was the question that was asked of Attorney General, the current Attorney General at one point in Congress. I can't remember, and it was Rand Paul who asked that question, I believe, trying to get an answer from him. And finally he did, I think, and he said that they would not do that inside the United States. But just the fact that it took him he had to say it so many times and keep going back to that question says that even that answer is in question. So I'm not sure where our government. You see, you can't trust our current government. They just don't tell you the truth anyway. They'll say, well, we had this secret interpretation. Congress passed a law. We had a secret interpretation, but they passed it again, so they must agree with our secret interpretation. When in fact the words in the law don't say what they're doing. So it's all hypocritical, and they're all basically criminals in my mind.
In a post 9/11 world, the idea of being spied on is no longer surprising. It's because we need to preserve our freedom and liberty in this country, and we have to lose our privacy. And that rhetoric has been out there for 13 years. The Snowden leaks led to a lot more clarity with respect to what it means to live in this post 9/11 world. And NBC News recently published Inside the Mind of Edward Snowden with the headline, "Exclusive: Snowden docs show British spies used dirty tricks." And when you read into it, it's about this group called the Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, or JTRIG, which is part of GCHQ. If you're familiar with JTRIG, could you tell me a little bit about it?
I'm not, so I can't. But because that happened after I left, I haven't been there for 13 years. So a lot of water has gone under the. But I'm reading up on it on the Snowden material, but I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that. So
one of the documents that was related to that was a GCHQ Five Eyes document that had a picture of a guy holding up a picture that said, "I'm not trying to impress you, but I'm Batman." And it was titled "The Art of Deception: Training a New Generation of Online Covert Operations." And again, this is something that's coming out of JTRIG and GCHQ in alliance with the NSA's programs, at least. So those were some of the things that I thought were interesting. I'm sure if you look into these types of things, they didn't happen when you were there, but I think you could see how the history that occurred while you were there has led into bigger and badder ways to spy on us in a more comprehensive manner.
Yeah, well, that's a typical way that FBI would do entrapment procedures. They would try to entrap people by pretending to be who they weren't, and soliciting things. That's fundamentally how most of the cases that they say they've stopped have been stopped. It's people they solicit to do terrorism. When in fact the Leahy Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, querying the NSA, Alexander and all, said they started out saying, first of all, that the program, meaning the domestic spying program, prevented 56 terrorist attacks in the United States. And then when they were challenged by the committee over and over again, they finally boiled it down to one. And they said, well, we got this fellow who transferred $8,500 to Al-Shabaab in North Africa, and that was one that this program stopped. Well, if the one end is in North Africa, that's not a domestic collection issue. So the answer is really zero. So their claim that this prevents terrorist attacks is absolutely false. It has prevented zero. All it's done is given the FBI a treasure trove to look at for persecution or arresting anybody they want. That's what it's done. And that's the big user of it. And those are the people who aren't even monitored by the courts as to how they're using the data. It's all, if you've listened to all the rhetoric coming out of the administration, it's all about the analysts at NSA, when in fact they're not the real problem. The real problem is FBI and DEA and DHS and IRS.
What's the purpose of the Utah Data Center in Bluffdale, Utah?
Well, it's to hold all of the content of data they've been collecting. And the claim that that metadata is all they're after, well, if they were only after metadata, they could put the entire world's metadata in every domain of relationships that exists in a room that's about 20 foot by 40 foot. That would be all it would take to handle all of the relationships in the world. You put up 8 to 10 foot racks and load the racks up with a thumb size thing can hold a terabyte now. You put thousands of them up there in each rack, and then rack after rack after rack, and you can pretty much and you use the condensed version of a graphing technique, and so that puts the graph together on any domain in much less than one rack. So you could hold the entire world's metadata relationship in the database that would require a 20 by 40 foot room to hold, allowing for cooling too. So the rest of that would be for the entire world, for everybody in the NSA community or the intelligence community. So the other 999,000 plus square feet of Bluffdale are being used for what? And that's for content, because content is the real bulk of data that they're collecting. That takes a lot of storage. Metadata does not.
In relation to trying to solve the problem of legal surveillance in a world where it's increasingly difficult and there's more sources of metadata, at one point in your career, you were offered, there was a project, it was a $1.2 billion project, and they gave you some goals, and you went off and you could only spend how much, and why weren't they happy with that?
Actually, that was the NSA Transformation Office that came down and offered our group in the SARC $1.2 billion to manage the moving the NSA into the digital world, that is taking care of all the volume, velocity, and variety problem. And they said, well, what could you do with that and get back to us? And we said, well, okay, give us a few days, 4 or 5 days, and we'll come back to you. So we sat down and tried to figure that out with all the people we had there, 4 or 5 of us, and who were doing the planning for the group. And we felt that we could do the entire world of NSA and all these sites all around the world and upgrade everything, even all the way back in the NSA, manage it and do everything we wanted to do with it, collect everything and that we should collect, and also look through everything basically, but only pull out what was relevant to the targets we were after, and make it a valuable source of information for all our analysts. But we felt that we could only spend about $300 million. That would be the entire amount that would upgrade the world for NSA. And we told it was the deputy chief of the NSA Transformation Office that offers that. We told him that. He said, that's really great. He went away and said, thanks very much, I'll be back. And he went away. And came back about 2 days later, and he says, that was really great what you told us. Now, what can you do for $1.4 billion? I said, well, we could still spend about $300 million, no matter how much you want to give us. I mean, we could probably try to think of other programs to run and do, or things to upgrade capabilities and infrastructure, maybe a building or two, I don't know, whatever would be needed logistically, that kind of thing we could do. But we could never spend all that money. Not the way we operated.
So in other words, it's a finite planet. 300 million could actually do the job. That's not good enough, and they want more, and they need to keep their budgets bigger, so they need to be able to have private contractors that come in and spend all that money, right? And they're getting away from solving the problem, and they're getting into abusing the truth for profit.
That's right. And the point was they wanted these corporations to feed on the money. It was a build up the corporations as well as the NSA for the NSA's budget, for the numbers of people working for NSA, also for the contractors and the number of contracts they had with them. So it was a much larger enterprise going through these military industrial intelligence complex. And I think Washington Post did 3 articles on it last year. I think the Top Secret America was what it was called. They gave 3 different front page accounts on all the facilities for the intelligence community around the United States, and what happened after 9/11 and how it all got built up. And that shows you where all the money went to do this. It went into the pockets of contractors.
And even though Poindexter's total information awareness was shut down because it was just too obvious, the same plans that DARPA came up with appear to have just continued on with other projects.
It was ongoing at NSA, and it was just to test the waters to see if they could do it openly. And that told them they couldn't, so they continued in secret. And they're still trying to keep as much of it secret as possible. I mean, even in the Reuters article that came out about the parallel constructions and how they used the NSA data to arrest people, one of the federal agents in that quote gave a quote to one of the Reuters reporters. He said, "This is such a great program. I just hope we can keep it secret." Well, that's our secret government in operation.
Can you compare and contrast the surveillance state under Bush versus Obama?
Yeah, it's only gotten worse under Obama. I mean, the expenditures are greater, the facilities are greater, the collection capability is greater. Everything's getting worse, and they're going after more and more data. They're going after Facebook. Treasure Map is the latest one. They're trying to map every device in the world that people use to communicate with, so that they can monitor it and where it is all throughout the day by day. So it's like having all the machine access code numbers and all of the phone numbers and all of the IP address, permanent IPs, as well as temporaries as they're used, or IMSI or TIMSI kind of combinations that they're used for phones. So, I mean, that's there for them, and they want to compile that and monitor that throughout the day, every day, on everyone.
Can you describe your frustration and disappointment in the post 9/11 world insofar as people being tricked into trading their liberty for the illusion of security?
I guess my my frustration is why I couldn't get through to government, members of government in the House, Senate, or in the judiciary, or in the administration, or in the Inspector General's office, or anywhere, to actually start to realize what they were doing is stand up and say something against it openly. That was kind of the very frustrating part, because you thought these people who took the same oath of office that I did would actually do that, and you also thought that they would value the principles in the Constitution and what they stood for in terms of human rights and human freedom. But they don't apparently care for that. I mean, it's more it becomes an issue of money, control, and power, and it's not a question of human rights anymore. So that's been the most frustrating part for me. I'm disappointed in that. I'm really more disappointed in the American public that they aren't more irritated. I mean, they're starting to get there, but it's taking a long time. They aren't. I guess not too many remember history, or not too many think of history. Well, I can understand the fact that we haven't had a totalitarian ruler here since George III, so about 240 years. Whereas the Germans, the Germans are really sensitive to this stuff. Why? Because they've got living memory of people who used to live under the Stasi, or people who used to live under, still some of them, under the Gestapo and the SS. They know firsthand what a totalitarian state is like to live under. And even a German couple told to Tom Drake when he was over there visiting one time, they said, we are in a post-fascist state. You're in a pre-fascist state and don't even know it. So I think the American public needs to wake up and start standing up and opposing this and firing bums in Washington that don't do the right thing by the Constitution. We need to fire them all. And you do that by voting, by the way.
You were quoted in the past as saying, it's disgusting that all those people had to die. It's disgusting that our government did that.
Yeah.
Why is it disgusting?
Because they had the way and means of preventing it. All they had to do was adopt it starting in January 2001, and these guys wouldn't have gotten to square one. Because all the data that they were using, they were communicating still, and it was all the evidence was there. And it was in the databases, they just couldn't get to it. Well, the program we had would have pulled it out immediately and shoved it in everybody's face, not just in NSA, but around the intelligence community, so they wouldn't have had a chance to miss it. In other words, no one person could ignore it anywhere in the system. It wasn't dependent on people to pick it out. So, I mean, that was the way to handle that. That would have stopped it almost immediately. I mean, those guys could never have landed in San Diego from Kuala Lumpur without us knowing it before they got off the plane. Actually, after they got on the plane, we know it. So, So we should have been prepared immediately when they landed to follow them and map out the entire network of collaborating terrorists inside the country, just from that.
Is it unreasonable to ask the question whether or not the NSA took a dive in order to take some money, grow their budget, grow their power, grow their empire?
I think the emphasis was to ignore things that would be helpful, to promote the budget. That was the general trend, and I don't think any of them anticipated what would happen, but surely they could anticipate that they were making the country vulnerable in the process. That was easy to understand, and so they were willing to take that risk to get the money, which that's why I accuse them of trading the security of our people for money.
In 1 to 2 sentences, what do you want the American people and people of the planet to know about how things are right now in the 21st century?
What I see happening is the intelligence communities or agencies of the world are gaining too much influence over government, how governments operate. And this is moving really to a Stasi state, basically. And it's not just the United States, it's countries all around the world. So I think in terms of oversight by any government, anywhere in the world, of intelligence agencies, they have to find and make sure they have ways and means of verifying what those agencies are telling them. They have to have outside sources coming in and validating what they're being told. I mean, otherwise these agencies will do basically whatever they want to do and tell whatever story they want to Congress or any other equivalent government organ anywhere in the world. So you have to be aware that these agencies are threatening what is fundamental to human rights everywhere. And you've got to ensure that you have some way of verifying and keeping these agencies in line. And whatever it takes in law and whatever it takes technically to make that happen, these governments around the world, all of them need to do.
What subjects do you think most people they're in the midst of using technology that gives them certain vulnerabilities? What resources or where can they start to kind of find out, well, where are these vulnerabilities and how do I mitigate those risks?
Actually, if you're a target, I don't believe there's any way you can eliminate the risk. I mean, in fact, I don't think there's anything you could do to stop. If they're after you, they're going to get you one way or the other. I mean, there are so many, if they can't get it through the internet, through the tapping of the lines or anything like that, through a commercial means, and they're unsure about you, they can get it by close access means, coming in and actually bugging your house or bugging your, or putting monitors in your system, in your house or on your computer. They can use your computer video to look back at you. Or they can monitor within a certain distance the keystrokes you're making on your computer or what you're putting on your computer screen. And if that's not enough, they can come in through the firewall you think you have but don't, and go through your operating system that you think protects you but doesn't, and read your encrypted email that you thought was secure but isn't. Or they can simply wait for you to do decrypts if you've done that, pull them off, and use your unused CPU while you're on the computer to drain it. It's called active attack. So if you're a target, there's virtually nothing you can do. And if they fail in their electronic means, they can always send the FBI at you to do a sneak and peek and take your photograph or do whatever they want. As they have done with us, by the way.
So why should people resist?
I personally don't. I get out there right in their face and say to them what I think of them and what I believe they're doing from all the material I've got from the Snowden releases and everything else. So I mean, in fact, after I started doing that, Director Clapper came out and said no former or current employees of the intelligence communities are permitted to discuss any of the Snowden material. If they do, there's going to be administrative action. What's that mean? It take away your clearance. Well, they've already done that, so I've got nothing to lose there, and I've got my First Amendment right to speak about anything in the public domain to stand up for, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I told him at the National Press Club, that I will not give up my First Amendment rights for anybody, and that includes Director Clapper.
With regard to ensuring that history no longer repeats and we don't end up with our own Gulag archipelago and none of us have to be a Solzhenitsyn in this country, what do you have to say to the audience in America who can't believe that their government would ever do anything like this to them? What can you say to wake them up?
You mean beyond what I've already been saying? You know, I really don't know. I've been trying to make it clear to them that they're all in jeopardy. Certainly we are a case in point. Jim Risen is another case. I mean, plus the entire reporting pool of reporters anywhere in any industry, in news as well as in video or TV, radio, or in print. They're all in jeopardy, and that's what the government here is trying to silence. They're trying to keep reporters from being able to investigate things, and that's a straightforward violation of the First Amendment, freedom of press. But it's also it says what they're doing is that they don't want the public to know what the government, are doing, and that's a very that's the total flip of what our entire foundation, the founders of this country, had intended, and our entire process is. The Constitution and all the amendments is set up so that the people are supposed to know what the government's doing. The government's not supposed to know what the people are doing unless they show probable cause and in a court of law. And that has all been scrapped. I mean, we're no longer abiding by that, and they don't have the courage to come out and say that. They don't have the courage to come out and say, this is what we're doing and we want your approval, public, to do it. You know, because it's just totally against all the founding principles of this country. And I don't know what else to say to people to try to get them riled up, but if you don't stop this, if you don't stand up and speak against this, it's going to get worse and worse, and there may be a point of no recovery if we don't stop it. And I'm not sure where that is, but certainly the things that they're doing, the things they're passing, like the NDAA Section 1021 to authorize them to take people off the street, incarcerate them without due process, the killing of people, U.S. citizens outside the country, the hesitation to say they wouldn't do it inside the country, and then kind of begrudgingly saying, no, we wouldn't do it. You know, I just don't trust that answer, and I just don't trust the government that we currently have or where it's going. I mean, I just think we need to, as a public, stand up and take it back, take our freedoms back, and take our country back. Because we don't have it now.
Okay. Bill, is there a question in your mind that I should have asked you that I didn't? I was going to email you and say, hey,
I think
after all these interviews, somebody didn't ask you a really good question. I want to ask that question, but I didn't want to send it because I didn't want to invite the NSA to comment.
They might have answered it for me,
Yeah.
right? A little insert there, you know? Like, go to hell, I can't make it, or something, you know, they might have said that, right? No, I don't, I think you pretty much covered it. Like I say, you had a pretty good list there, so.
Then you're off the hook. Thank you so much.
Give it to him. I'm depending on you guys to punch him in the face with it, right? So that was the game they played. And that was the storytelling spinning that went on with Congress, too. Anytime they wanted to get money, they'd spin a story up and they'd say, here's the story we're going to tell. Everybody line up, this is the story. You know, ooh, I'd say, wait a minute, you know, there might be something, yeah, I don't want to do that. You know, you can't get in line. It's corporate uber alles. In fact, Hayden wrote a Durgram 87 about us, which I have a copy. I could send you one if you want. It basically said we need to, once the corporation decides what we're going to do, we need everybody to, I don't want everybody to be totally submissive, but once we make the decision, everybody needs to get behind it and support it. And we don't want anybody going off the corner doing anything different, you see. That's that single thought, corporate uber alles, board collective thinking. And what it said to the technical people at NSA is we don't want you being creative and innovative. That's what it said. It was very clear. So one of my friends, one of the seniors down in the old Russia shop that I'd left to be the world technical director, said that he found a quote from a 1906 speech that said exactly the same thing, except this one was given by Ilyich Lenin. And instead of the corporation, he said the party. Otherwise, the words are identical. He was a little more crisper and clearer, but said exactly the same thing. Once the party decides, get behind the party decision.